The town of Greyhaven kept its winters in the bones of its houses. Even in late March, the wind held the memory of snow and salt, and the harbor's surface looked like an old bruise. Greyhaven had been the sort of place that liked its stories neat. School burned and rebuilt in tidy red brick. The same three families running the feed store for generations, annual parades, and a mayor who had never lost an election. People in Greyhaven were careful to remember only would fit their edges. Margaret Rowe's funeral did not fit. She had been a small, tidy woman, with hair that refused to lie flat and a laugh that sounded surprised at itself. For 28 years she had lived at the end of Seabury Lane in a two-story clapboard house with a blue door and a porch swing that creaked like an old hinge. She baked bread on Sundays. She taught local kids to read in summer workshops. She had a plant in the kitchen that never withered. She also had secrets the town never guessed. Her death was wet and fast, a stroke, the doctor said, and the town stitched the story up with condolence cards and casseroles. At the funeral, men in dark coats lined the church and shook the hands of her son and daughter with practiced, consoling gestures. They brought up Tom Aldridge's name in the whispering crowd because Tom Aldridge, Margaret, until he died 10 years earlier, had been an easy cushion, a gentleman, a mason, buried under a small stone in Greyhaven Cemetery, marked simply Tom Aldridge, 1935-1977. The town liked the tidy myth. Margaret married young, lived a modest life, raised 2 good children, mourned quietly when the man left them. It made sense. Nora found the letter on the 3rd evening after the funeral, folded into the brittle spine of an old Bible Margaret kept on a low bookshelf. Nora had been digging for keepsakes, a photograph with a crooked smile, the shell of a locket. Jonah, her brother, had been upstairs letting the house go cold. Nora should have left the Bible alone, the thought came in a small, polite voice in the back of her head, but she had a habit of wanting to know everything the way some people wanted to collect coins. The envelope was yellowed paper, the handwriting a thin, measured script Nora recognized instantly. Margaret's, all loops and small crosses. On the front, in ink that had bled with time, someone had written, "For Nora and Jonah, read together." Nora sat at the kitchen table under the single bare bulb and, as if moving through deep water, slid the letter free. The paper smelled faintly of lemon oil and dust. The letter began with a sentence that was not the sort of thing Margaret said in kitchens or classrooms. "If you are reading this, I could not protect you any other way." Nora felt the keening pull of grief tighten and then loosen as if some mechanism had moved inside her. She read the letter once, then again, and the kitchen lights seemed to hang closer to the table. The longer she read, the stranger the rhythm of the words. A mother's voice, yes, but tempered by a coldness that belonged to someone who had considered consequences too long. Margaret's letter told a history that unstitched the neatness of Greyhaven. Their father, the letter said, not Tom Aldridge, was a man named Harrison Caldwell. The name might not have meant much if not for the church's good graces. Harrison's son, outlived by his father in name and in office, was the mayor of Greyhaven, Arthur Caldwell, whose photo hung in the municipal building and who had stood at Margaret's wake with a handkerchief and a measured sermon about community and steadiness. Arthur had always been a polite geometry in a crowd, hairline comb-over, handshake exact, laugh at the predictable places. He had been mayor for 15 years. He had lived in a house 3 blocks from the dock that adults in town declared immaculate and tasteful. Margaret wrote, in thin, firm script, "I met Harrison once, when I was 19. He was not the man I married. He was the man who took me that summer. He is the reason the house has been paid for. He is the reason your childhood was safe enough and the reason our house always smelled of lemon. He is your father." The sentence did not say what Nora had been waiting for, whether Harrison was dead, whether he had loved Margaret, whether she had been taken by him willingly. The letter breathed around history like a cat avoiding puddles. Nora felt a cold curiosity at the base of her skull. She rose, walked to the phone, and dialed Jonah. He answered on the second ring. His voice had a rubbed-out quality to it, as if he spoke softly to save the air. "You read it?" he asked. "Yes." Does it say anything else?" "It says he gave her money. It says she kept quiet for us. It says they promised she would be the only one who knew and she would burn any proof. It says she could not continue to hide it." There was a silence in Jonah's end that sounded like someone listening to the radio for a station that wasn't there. "I'll be there in 20, he said finally. Jonah came in the dark, his coat still dusted with ash from the cigarette he had decided not to smoke. He had the narrow build of a man who'd climbed a lot of roofs in his 20s to fix chimneys and then decided the work was too close to silence. He taught at the middle school 2 towns over. His students liked the way he read out loud. I'd always thought of Jonah as that large, calm sea animal. The patient, the steady, the one who would come when the tide turned. They tore the house apart with the quiet efficiency of those who have learned where grief hides things. They found little things, a bank booklet with small deposits into the Rowe household account from a name they didn't know, a trunk of postcards from a town in Massachusetts with ink-stamped postmark that predated Tom by a dozen years, a photograph of Margaret standing in front of an old wharf, the man behind her blurred by motion, but the curve of his jaw like a shadow. Under the floorboard in the pantry, an old trick Margaret used during blizzards, they found a scrap of paper with H. Caldwell and a date. The town had a memory long enough to remember a scandal from 30 years ago. Harrison Caldwell had never been publicly accused of anything. Rather, the rumor had been a quiet current. There had been a series of events in the late 1950s, a summer when 3 young women in neighboring Kingston had vanished. The papers ran a fumbling small-town front page for a single week. The investigations found nothing. Harrison Caldwell, a man of position and late-night contributions, left that season for Europe on business. He returned, never charged. He later married a woman in another county. His son, Arthur, inherited his name and a ledger of favors. Margaret's letter forced Nora and Jonah to hold 2 truths at once: that their mother had been violated by a man of consequence, and that the same man's son now presided over the town that had kept Margaret safe in other ways. The letter called for retribution, but did not instruct how to do it. It left a single sentence at the end, written small. "If you find him, do not show him my face. Let him find his own."
They started quietly. They kept it from the town. Nora, who had left Greyhaven 10 years earlier for Boston and photography school, felt the city's habit of anonymity peeling away at her until only sharp edges remained. She returned to Greyhaven not as a daughter, but as a sleuth. She photographed doors, license plates, and hands at windows. Jonah stomped through the municipal records in the town hall with a worn baseball cap fisted in his fingers like a talisman. He asked old neighbors the sorts of questions that do not look like questions. Did Harrison ever come here? Do you recall anyone visiting Margaret in the summer of '58? They were careful, too careful, made things dangerous. But the house threw off proofs the way a wounded animal sheds hair. In the municipal ledger, Jonah found a notation, a donation, significant and intermittent, to Rowe Household from Caldwell Trust. The amounts were tidy and precise, as if written by someone who calculated grace. There were legal documents, too, signatures that Margaret had made without reading entirely, transfers that explained why, for all the town's talk of poverty, her house always had heat and coal. Mayor Arthur Caldwell, when Nora approached him at a book signing for a charity, smiled with the public ease of a practiced man. He placed his hand on his chest in the particular way men do when they want to prove authenticity without words. He made small talk about parish projects, the playground upgrade, and the need for more volunteers at the library. He said he had known Margaret for years, was sorry for their loss, and that she had always been a solid, generous soul. Nora's throat tightened at the word generous. The camera, heavy at her hip, made the gesture of a tongue, ready to capture the tell. She wanted to ask him about the summer of 1958, about Harrison, about the little inscrutable marks of a life paid for quietly, but the town made its necessities into armor. No one wanted to start a war with a mayor. They expected resistance. They hadn't expected the letter to make the air around their lives heavier. The police asked them polite questions about the will. A neighbor called to say somebody had been around their property and asked odd things. Their mailbox, which had always contained a ribbon of local newsletters and the occasional pizza coupon, now had a folded scrap with the words written in blocky red ink, "Stop." When Nora photographed the Caldwell house in the Druzel, a wide house posed like a politician, she noticed something she hadn't in the formal way of a lens. A small, smudged paint mark on the back stoop that matched the blue of Margaret's porch swing. "You realize someone's laundering favors," Jonah said one evening with the bluntness of a man who'd been staring at numbers. "Money doesn't arrive without tracks. Caldwell's name is on more ledgers than we think." They tried to thread their way inward. They asked a clerk at the bank to run transcriptions of the trust account. The clerk was helpful up to a point, and then helpful in the way a small-town clerk had to be, helpful enough to clear space for potential trouble later. People with offices had reputations to guard, and the Caldwell family had reputations like armor plates, thick, polished, and intimidating. It was in the margins of these moves, the late-night surveillance photos Nora took of men leaving the Caldwell house, the repeated trips to the municipal archive where Jonah found a ledger entry that smelled like bribery, that the danger first arrived. A car followed them once on the coastal road, a boxy sedan that never passed and kept a polite distance behind them. They stayed at each other's houses and whispered in kitchens. They learned to check mirrors. Nora, who by old habit resisted fear like a muscle used too hard, began sleeping with the Polaroids under her pillow because proofs, more than anything, made her feel even. One night, Jonah came into the kitchen, holding a newspaper clipping folded small. A story from 1958 about the disappearance of a girl named Elsie March. The photograph was grainy. The caption noted that the last sighting had been near the Essex Wharf. Under Jonah's hand in the margin of the clipping, somebody had written in a different hand the name H. Caldwell. Jonah tapped the alphabet on the table the way he might thumb a line of sewing. He said, "This was on Margaret's shelf. She kept it like she'd put aside a coin." Nora traced the outline of the face in the photograph. It was one of those faces that had no pretensions to the future. It belonged to a girl who would have been a woman today, in a different town, with a different ledger of memory. Nora felt something like grief she had not known she could take. Then the body on the shore turned up. A body the town reported in a single line because Greyhaven was a place that told itself not to look too long at trouble. They learned of it secondhand from a neighbor who'd been walking her dog at the break of dawn and stepped over the tide-smoothed, colorless thing and then hurried away. The body was a woman from the next town over. Her age matched. She had the same small scar beneath her chin the photo had shown. The coroner's report, when it came, was curt. Exposure, they said. No foul play confirmed. But the photograph was the same as the one Jonah had found. The town folded the story politely in a single afternoon and left the shore to the gulls. The police chief, Henry Greeley, was a man with a round belly and hands that liked to touch the brim of his hat. He had grown up in Greyhaven and knew how to keep the tide of rumor in place. He called Nora and Jonah into the station once in the harsh light of a weekday morning and said, "We appreciate that you've been asking questions, but you need to be careful. Accusations are heavy things. Your mother was a private person, and she might have wanted it that way." Nora was not given to outbursts in front of municipal officials. She kept her voice to the point. She asked us to find him. "Whom?" Gearley asked. He pinched the bridge of his nose then in a private habit. "Harrison Caldwell," Jonah said.
Chief Gearley took off his glasses, set them on the desk like a judge reconsidering a case, and when he spoke there was a strange timbre in his timbre. He said, "Harrison never did anything here. He was a businessman. He left, he came back. People spoke, but talk is talk. Margaret, had odd friends. You know this." His look went somewhere just outside the window where the municipal flag snapped. The implication was clear. Some questions make the air dangerous. It was not the sort of thing you did with drinks and a strand of salt and lemon cookies. They kept going anyway. The deeper they dug, the more the town knit itself tight. They found an old photo in the library archives of the town's harvest fair. Among the crowd, a young man with a full head of hair and a mouth that seemed to know how to close certain stories. Margaret was there, cheeks flushed. When they enlarged the print, Nora could see the tilt of the man's hat and the hand placed, almost ritualistically, at the small of her back. Pieces of Margaret's life were like flint. With enough pressure, they sparked the dangerous light of fire. Nora and Jonah found a cabin deed in another county with a barely readable name scratched into the margin. They tracked down the woman who had worked for Margaret as a teenager. She remembered a summer when Margaret had returned with a bad bruise and refused to speak of it. She remembered Margaret's insistence that the children be brought up to feel safe. As stories in Greyhaven leaked like tidewater through a pier, someone else started telling stories too. A rumor came to Margaret's funeral that a certain man had been seen with her in the late 1950s. Someone passed a folded piece of paper under a shop counter and said nothing. Nora's photographs began to disappear from the tray in the kitchen where she had set them to dry. They were not the only ones watching. In the late afternoons, when the light softened like used silver, a man in a gray suit sat at the far corner of the cafe and read the newspaper with a practiced cover. He watched their table once, then twice. He had a face like a question mark and hands of someone who had been told to be discreet. The man left and came again the next day. Messages in small, threatening capital letters showed up at their door. The town, which had always been a community of careful faces, was becoming a thing that could kill for its comfort. The weight of the mayor's presence became a physical thing. He held charity galas that the town attended in grateful clusters. He gave speeches that made people feel morally snug. He attended Margaret's memorial and placed a single white carnation on the coffin because that was what men of his type did with their cords of sanctimony. His photo appeared in the paper not as an ordinary local, but as a guardian of propriety. Some nights Nora dreamed of glass. She dreamed that the town's neat panes were fragile and that someone was stepping outside to slide a rock across the sill. She woke up with her hands clutching photographs she had put under her pillow. Jonah slept in the armchair in the parlor with the television on because he could not stand the silence of the bed they had shared once in bitter younger years. Then a raw, gray morning, Arthur Caldwell's motorcade came down from the hill and parked in front of the municipal building in a way that suggested the mayor had things to do that were not for the public. He stepped out amongst the town council and cameras and shook hands the way men do when they want to control form. Omaha Mayor's expression did not change when he saw Nora across the street with an old lens in her hand. But later
Over the next days, Greyhaven tightened. The mayor's team issued small, pointed public gestures of goodwill. He appeared at the nursing home to play dominoes, at the library to read to children. At the funeral of an elderly man who'd known Margaret in youth, he delivered a speech about the sanctity of dignity. Everyone's eyes were careful. Those who had seen the road children near the municipal building the other night began to say things like, "We don't want to make trouble," as if trouble were contagious. Then, two things happened at once. First, someone put a fire into the back of a sedan in the mayor's lot and left a message painted across the hood. "Lies burn." The town came out in a flutter of shock and conspiracy. People lined the sidewalks with coffee cups and knew to stand back from the police tape. Second, Margaret's house was broken into. They stole the Bible, the very one that had contained the letter, and left the house otherwise untouched. It was obvious to Nora that whoever had taken the Bible wanted to control the map they'd been given. The thief left no fingerprints. They took nothing else. They left a small smear of blue paint on the back step, the same shade as Margaret's porch swing. People in Greyhaven shrank and said soft things about lunar tides and the strangeness of youth. They muttered as if whispering could wash their hands clean. Nora curled the recorder against her chest and played the tape in the dark. Harrison sounded tired. Arthur sounded polite. But beneath the words was the hum of something more dangerous, the unmistakable satisfaction of a man who thinks himself a keeper. The tape was not enough to reveal intent. It had not named the act of violence. It had only admitted a relationship and the paying off of a wound with money. On the edges of the town, someone else made a decision. Chief Greeley called them both in the next morning. He was worried and apologetic in the way men are when they must tell family members that their private affairs are now public property. He said, without preamble. He slid a worn brown envelope across the table. Inside was a list of names, the girls who had vanished in the 50s and early 60s. He pushed it toward them like fish on a plate. At the bottom of the list, in handwriting he recognized from the Bible's margins, someone had written the words, "People like us lose quietly." Nora had the peculiar sensation of stepping off the edge of a quay and finding, with a lurch, that the water below was deeper than she'd thought. The list clanged like a bell. It made the town into something monstrous and then small. "You should leave it to us," Chief Greeley said. "You can see your mother's letters with the coroner. We've recovered what we can. But I need you to understand something. These things have a way of hurting people who don't deserve it." Nora folded the list into herself like a shield and walked out into the bright light of morning. Jonah followed. On the kitchen table that afternoon, Nora played the recorder again. The tape captured something she had not heard before, a slow inhalation from Harrison, a sound like a man preparing an apology. Then, below the mayor's voice, a second voice, not Harrison's and not Arthur's. It was Margaret's voice, faint, as if from another room, saying, "Promise me." Nora's hands tightened on the recorder until her knuckles showed white. She realized, impossibly, horribly, that Margaret, who had died ostensibly of natural causes, had recorded a conversation. She had expected, perhaps, that the recorder would send the truth into a place of public shame. She had expected that the tape would be anchor enough. But whoever had taken the Bible had also taken the recorded confession. Or perhaps not. Perhaps she had left duplicates. They could not know. The town's walls were closing like a fist. That evening, Nora found that her camera had been smashed on the porch. Its lens was a web of broken glass. Someone had gone through her photographs and taken the ones they wanted. They left one photograph in the smashed camera's place. It was a Polaroid of the mayor in his study, smiling with a ribbon across his lapel, and someone had written across the white margin in heavy ink, "Stay out." The message was unmistakable. Someone who wanted the story buried had the capacity to send fire trucks and men with heavy boots. Someone who had the power to pay had the means to silence. And they had, in all the doing, made it personal. Nora lay awake that night and thought of the letter in the Bible, and the way her mother's voice was careful and precise. She wondered if Margaret had regarded the mayor as a god, if she had thought his money could be a remedy. She wondered if forgiveness and silence had once been a currency. In the end, the thing that made the difference was not the law's slow grind, it was the town. A woman, one of Margaret's summer students from decades ago, came forward at the library with a photograph she said she'd been saving like a relic.
The photograph showed Margaret with a child in a summer cottage by the wharf, and in the background a figure whose face was obscured by a turned cap. The woman claimed she had found it in a box Margaret had left at the woman's mother's house and had kept it for the right moment. For a day, it was as if someone had thrown a stone into a shallow pool, and the town could not stop watching the widening circles. People began to talk where they had not, at the bar, in the post office, in the line at the bakery. Rumors have gravity. Once enough of them pull in a direction, truth sometimes slides along a new course. On the 5th day after the car had burned, someone called the police and said a man had been seen carrying a box from a shed behind the mayor's property late at night. They sent patrols to investigate, and when the driveway lights of the mayor's house came on, the man was already gone. But the shed door was ajar, and inside they found a stack of boxes. In the lowest box, wrapped in oilcloth, they found Margaret's Bible. It looked like a small mercy. Chief Greeley handled it with that weary gentleness of men who don't get to pick the sharp things they must do. The Bible went to the station. They found the letter inside and listened to the tape, which was more brilliant than Nora had hoped. On it, Margaret's voice was steady as she said, "You will not name this in church. You will not drag the ledger into the sunlight. You will help me keep my children safe." Then in the space of a breath, another voice, young, frightened, "How can we make them safe?" Nora heard Margaret say simply, "We will do what we can." Then the tape cut. The next day, the mayor resigned. Not publicly in shame, not with a scandal telegraphed in the papers. He simply submitted a note in polite hand to the council and walked out of the town hall, his face as blank as a man who has not yet learned to inhabit his new non-existence. The town said at first that he had chosen to retire, that the pressures of office had taken their toll, but out in the street, the air changed. People who had once been polite turned up at the row house with casseroles and stories. They wanted to be close to something that had the shimmer of heroism. For a week, Nora and Jonah exhaled, as if the world had released them from a taut string. They thought that perhaps the truth, when invited into the sun, would be purified. Then, a man from the prosecution's office arrived, bearing a warrant. He had the air of a man used to sorting the world into black and white. He told them, quietly but with authority, that evidence had surfaced linking the mayor to certain misdeeds. The question of criminality, he said, would take time. That night, on the corner near the harbor, where gulls screamed and street lights threw yellow pools, Nora and Jonah stood and looked at one another as if at the end of a long march. The town had shown glimpses of courage. The mayor had resigned. Margaret's Bible had been found. Nora felt the heavy thudding of hope, foolish and bright. She took Jonah's hand without thinking, as if letting go would send the whole fragile barrel of memory to pieces. They did not know that the town's patience had limits. They did not know, in that naive quiet, that the real stubborn thing in Greyhaven had not yet shown its teeth. It was a Thursday when the truth finally unfolded itself like an old map, the kind painted in crimson on the backing of the town's complacencies. They found a ledger in the mayor's study, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of a pile of civic donations. It was a small book, its cover soft with smudged fingers. The ledger did not pretend to be anything but a record. It had names and dates and amounts written in a hand that could have belonged to anyone who liked to order things. For the first time, the evidence looked like a body with fingers and the start of a face. The ledger had entries for not just payments to Margaret, but to families in neighboring towns where other girls had vanished. It had names of men who had, on paper, been convenience purchases, legal retainer, settlement, housing. It had a list of 3 cottages on the coastline, each with a name that matched a photograph. It had dates, tidy and cold. When the prosecutor turned the ledger in his hands, his mouth pursed. "This is the beginning of something," he said, "but it won't be the whole story." The whole story was not something the town had the courage for. People are slow at dismantling their myths. It was in the ledger, under winding numbers and entries, that Nora found something that shrank her to silence. In the margin, in a hand she recognized immediately, Margaret's thin script were the words,
He sat in the prosecutor's office with his head bowed and told the story in that weary tone of a man who had been shaped by guilt into a shape that could only confess. The prosecutor listened as the tides secreted broken things onto the shore. He typed into the typewriter the words of the man who had been the town's shield. Nora watched the scene unfold at the prosecutor's side with a bitterness that tasted like salt. Henry Greeley, who had offered them safety in small measures and had cautioned them like a father, had indeed been a father, not to them biologically in any modern sense, but to an arrangement, to secrets, and to a trembling, private sorrow. It felt as if the world had rearranged itself. The town's save-for-later ledger had been peeled back and found the human calculus beneath it. People wept or laughed with the weird, brittle humor of a crowd relieved that the truth was concrete. The prosecutor's office put out press announcements. The murmurs transformed into a kind of righteous hunger for the law. The mayor's name receded like a storm, small in the distance. Nora felt lightheaded with the dizzying arithmetic of guilt and mercy. Her mother had written that Henry Greeley was the father, but the letters made no promises about absolution. The question that now dreamed in the houses like a fly trapped against glass was, if Henry Greeley had been the man who had offered comfort in the darkness, who had been the men who had taken the girls? The answer was complicated and not what she had been waiting for. Because in the ledger, one name repeated in a pattern too precise to be coincidence. It was a name that belonged not to the mayor, nor to the chief, but to a man who had built things, who had given speeches for a lifetime of civic improvements, who had provided jobs and sponsorships like a man who stacked stones with both hands. It was a name that made Nora's vision go white. It was the name Arthur Caldwell had tried to shield, Harrison Caldwell. Harrison had not been purely the man who had made a mistake. He had been a part of the system that used men's consumption and privilege as a currency, and he had used it in a way that made other crimes easier to commit. If Henry Greeley had been a father in a small private way, then Harrison and his cohort were the hands that had made policy into a net. The ledger now lit that net with evidence. People had been bought, silenced, moved. The prosecutor leaned across his desk and said quietly, "This is not one simple case. It implicates more than just a few men of means. The town will have to decide how much it wants the truth." Nora stared at him. She thought suddenly of Margaret's voice on a tape, standing before a small recorder and asking for mercy like a plea. It was not mercy that would close the circle. It was the town's willingness to confront the men behind the ledger. That would be the real measure of Greyhaven. For a day or two, the town seemed to shake awake. People convened in kitchens. The bakery displayed headline clippings, and conversations that had been muted for decades became public. The prosecutor's office moved forward with interviews and subpoenas. The men whose names had been written like fingerprints on the ledger began to avoid street corners. Arthur Caldwell, who had once been their protector, found himself the subject of lurid gossip. Harrison, who had been an absentee and a presence in the same breath, found his old haunts empty. And then, in the small hours of a Friday morning when gulls had not yet begun their cry and the harbor was a slate of black, the town found the body of Margaret Rowe, washed up small and white on the rocks near the pier. It looked at first as if she had fallen, or had faded to sleep among the stones. But the coroner's hands told another story. There were marks on her wrists where she had been held. There were bruises on her side and places that said she had been engaged in a fight. Her heart, in the way the coroner arranged the words, was slow and exhausted. The investigators who had come from outside the county murmured of old secrets becoming violent. Nora stood on the other side of the tape with Jonah and watched as men in gloves moved through the shallow black water with flashlights. She felt nothing at first, but a flatness that was like the washed bones of the shore. She wanted to scream at the sky that this had been the price for asking the truth. She wanted to accuse the town of making murder an easy thing. But all that came out was a small animal sound, like a sob. Something cold passed through the crowd gathered on the pier. People who had once been eager to learn the ledger's names now stood in small knots and said, "We can't be sure." They folded their hands against the wind as if they could still keep the town warm. As they passed Nora with a polite, careful step, someone muttered the sort of townspeople say when they mean to bruise. She brought it on herself. Nora felt a rage like a new temperature rise in her bones. She wanted nothing more than to make everyone feel the painful tightness of accountability. She wanted to drag every single ledger page into the sunlight and make them read their handwriting aloud. She wanted, with a furious sincerity, to make the town pay for being small. And then Jonah touched her arm, and the touch was the only thing that could anchor a person at the sea's edge. He said quietly, "We have proof. We have names. Margaret left us something that matters." Nora nodded, and the ledger opened inside her like a map she had to follow. The town's dutiful hush had been broken. The prosecutorial tide had begun. Margaret's voice, recorded and written, had been enough to stir the waters. The town in the next weeks would do what towns do. It would try to save itself by pinning blame on a single person. The prosecutor would make his calls. The men named would deny everything. The question that haunted Nora like a bad weather front was what the ledger had really meant. What did it mean that a town would be willing to shake itself until someone fell? The answer, as Nora would later learn in the thin, bright hours before the storm's eye opened, was that the ledger had been not an accusation, but a map to the true center of power, a center that had worked under the careful cloak of public benevolence and private appetite. It had been a map that led, inexorably, not away from, but into the lowest room. And in that room sat a man who had once been the town's father, who had the kind of face people trusted when they laid their hands on something fragile. When they finally brought the man in, not in the mayor's suit, but with the old carpenter's weight of someone who had always been in the town's sight, Henry Greeley's hands were steady on the table as he told the prosecutor where he had hidden papers. He did not fight them. He spoke as if confessing had been the relief he needed. The prosecutor, who had started with ledger spreadsheets and careful cross-checks, looked down at his typewriter and said softly, "We may have more than we thought." Nora felt the terrible relief and the terrible expectation of a town on a hinge. They were about to open a door no one wanted to open, and everyone would have to step through.